Hi everybody, this is Mr. Nolan, and I would like to talk crystals with you. I have two goals for you in this video. What you should be able to do is first predict how different factors are going to influence how crystals grow, how big they grow, what they look like, their features, colors, how do these factors affect the growth of crystals. The other thing that I want you to be able to do is to talk to me about what's happening at the very, very tiny level. What is happening with the molecules and atoms and particles at the nanoscopic level that result in different crystal features. That's what I want you to be able to do. So I have some slides for you here. I also have some crystal samples to show you of ones that we created in class. So in our lab, we created some crystals. We explored some of these different factors. And so the purpose of this video is to just kind of lay those out on the table very, very clearly. So one thing that we looked at, and this is really the most important, but there are others to talk about too. One thing that we did was we took the same solution and the same mineral, and we cooled one off really quickly. And then the other one, we cooled it off more slowly. So there's a few ways that you can do that. One thing you could do is you could, leave it on the hot plate for longer. Or you could, in one group, we actually chilled the crystals with ice water. We chilled the solution with ice water to see how that rate of cooling would influence the growth of the crystals. So we have in these boxes, we have some little crystals, and then we have some bigger crystals. And what it turns out, the relationship between the size of the crystal and the rate of cooling is that the faster that you cool that solution, the smaller the crystal is. And so I have a couple of examples here in which we have a difference in the rate of cooling. So here's my two crystals. The one over here on the left side of the little box, this was cooled slowly. This one over here was cooled really rapidly. And actually, I guess I should switch them so they look that way on your screen. Here we go. So this one over here, this big one, this one was cooled slowly. This little one was cooled rapidly. And so what this means is that, well, if I cool off a crystal really fast, it's going to have small crystals. And if I cool the solution off slowly, we're going to have bigger crystals. And so that's just something that we observe in the lab. And we can use our nanoscopic sort of theory of what's going on in order to explain why. So the big thing, you cool it off faster, you get smaller crystals. They're also kind of crappier. Like they have sharper angles. They kind of have a whitish, milky look, whereas the ones that cool slower have kind of a clearer look. So they're just more perfect looking if you cool them off slower. That's observation number one. The slower you cool it off, the bigger and better the crystals look. The other thing that we experimented with was different temperatures. And I actually don't have an example here, but I have one on the screen. So in the case on the left, we have bigger crystals, and on the case at the right, we have kind of smaller crystals. Well, what would result in what kind of temperature changes would result in different crystals? It turns out that if your solution is hotter, if you get a really steaming hot solution, you're going to get a bigger crystal. And if your solution is not as hot, you actually get a smaller crystal. So we can talk about that, what's going on. Why is it a hotter solution gets you a bigger crystal and a cooler solution gets you a smaller crystal, a solution that never got as hot. Another biggie, which kind of seems obvious, but we just have to address it just to make sure we know what we're talking about. If you use different minerals, so crystals are made from minerals, and if you use if you have different minerals that are present in the crystal, you're going to get different properties. And so in these examples that I show you here, like for instance, if the mineral contains certain metals, it's going to end up with not only a different shape, a different size, a different crystal structure, it's also going to end up with different colors. And so if I were to just take two of these examples here, this crystal, which is on the left side of your screen over here, this one contains some copper. That copper is actually was dissolved in the solution as copper sulfate, and the copper is what makes it bluish. There's all kinds of minerals that have sulfates, but a lot of them actually are not colored. This is blue because of the copper. And we can go into all kinds of detail about why that is. The short thing to think about is that if you find a mineral that is colored, that has pretty colors, it's almost always because of a metal. A metal has been dissolved in that solution that made that crystal. This one on the left side of your screen does not have copper in it. It has sodium. It's sodium thiosulfate, which is what that crystal is. So even though they both have metals in them, this one, the clear one, just has sodium. This blue one has got copper. And it's not like you have to memorize which metals are going to result in colors. The important thing to recognize is that some metals will result in colored minerals, like this one, this copper sulfate. Other metals will result in minerals which are not colored, such as this sodium borate or borax. Right? So this is just a whitish sort of one that doesn't seem to have any color. So the actual identity of the mineral is likely to affect the color, especially if there are metals that are actually dissolved in it. So another factor that we can consider in terms of how these different factors affect crystals is the time of growth. And this is kind of a no-duh one, but I've got two examples here in which these crystals were grown for different periods of time. The one which is, let me flip these. There we go. So the one which is on the right side of your screen over here, this one was grown overnight. So this crystal took a long time to grow, and this crystal only grew for about 5 or 6 hours. And this one is a couple of grams heavier than this one. And so, like I said, it might seem like a no-duh sort of statement, but this crystal, which is quite a bit larger, grew longer. It had more time to grow. So if you give it more time to grow, you're also going to get a bigger crystal. No duh. So shorter time for growth, smaller crystals. Longer time for growth, bigger crystals. The other really odd thing that we observed was that when we took copper sulfate, some of us used, or some of you guys used paper clips, which are made of steel, as the cradle for your seed crystal. And then some of you used pipe cleaners. So this really, really nice example was made using a pipe cleaner, but this one right here was actually made using a paper clip. And so one thing that we observed here is that not only is copper sulfate, the copper, give us blue crystals, but after we exposed the paper clip to the copper sulfate, we got this brownish color on the paper clip. So if you look really closely at the paper clip right there, you notice it has this blackish brown color. And it might be tempting to say, oh, well, that's rust. The paper clip rusted. Well, it's not quite true. When this was fresh, when we actually took it out of the solution fresh, and some groups got really good results, this was a bright, lustrous, metallic reddish color. And if you think about it for a moment, the mineral was copper sulfate. There was copper in here. And then if we find a bright red, pretty coating on our paper clip, there's also some crystals of copper sulfate. What was the identity of that bright, red, pretty, glistening metal? It was probably the copper. It was the copper that was actually present inside the mineral solution that was dissolved. It actually underwent a reaction, and it's a single replacement reaction. This is a kind of oxidation reduction reaction where the copper was dissolved, it was oxidized, and as it plated out onto the paperclip, it became reduced. And you don't need to know those terms. The important thing is to recognize that there was a reaction, that this copper being plated out onto the paperclip was caused as a result of a chemical reaction. So sometimes you can actually get brand new substances because two minerals or two substances are actually interacting. Kind of an odd case, but it's something that does happen. So we've seen all these different features of minerals and what it says about how they were formed. But let's talk about the nano level. Let's talk about what's happening at the very, very small scale in order to try to sort of explain what's going on here. So this is crystallization at the nanoscopic level, and this is not a perfect analogy that I'm going to give you. It has to do with states of matter, but it kind of works. So there's a simulator online. This is a PhET simulator that you might have seen before. And what we have here is a container, and I want you to pretend, just for the sake of argument, I want you to pretend that this is your beaker. And the black stuff inside the beaker is just water. It's your solvent, whatever your solvent is. And the little blue circles are your mineral that you're talking about. And by the way, water is not the only solvent that will dissolve minerals. In the lab, we explored what would happen if we used alcohol as a solvent, and we found some big differences in the way that those crystals formed because of the solvent. You can have lava. Lava is something that dissolves stuff in it. Gases and minerals will dissolve in lava and magma. So if we're thinking ahead about rocks, magma could be our solvent, the stuff that's dissolving this stuff. Anyways, so we're imagining we've got our water or whatever our solvent is, and here's our particles of mineral. If I heat it up, what happens to those particles? You might remember from chemistry or from middle school science that those particles are vibrating. They're sort of zipping around, and so these little particles of our mineral have more energy to dissolve. This is why we heated up the minerals in the lab. That way we could get them to dissolve into the water. That way we could get lots of mineral to dissolve in there. Now, if I cool this down, just like we did in the lab when we let our mineral cool, that was when we saw crystals. And so we want to talk about why. So as I cool down our solution with our mineral dissolved in it, watch the particles. Look at what those particles are doing. They're starting to stick together. So because they don't have as much energy, they can't overcome those, the intermolecular forces actually overcome the vibration of the molecules. They're vibrating much more slowly. And so if you watch on your screen, if you look there, what we really have done by cooling this off and that solute is able to stick together, we have our crystal. This is really a crystal. That's what's going on here. And if you look closely, I don't know if you can see on your screen or not, if you look at that crystal, it's actually extremely organized. It's very carefully organized. It's easier to see if I actually click here, and there's your little crystal, right? There's your square crystal. It's almost in a honeycomb pattern. This is a very high degree of organization. You might remember entropy if you took chemistry to an advanced enough point where we were talking about organization. So this has low entropy, or another way to say that is that it's just very organized. This is a crystal. Now, those particles, in order to form that crystal and get that low entropy state, they cooled off and they started to sort of stick together. Those intermolecular forces kind of started sticking them together. And they aligned to what is called the crystal lattice. So like here, for instance, is a crystal lattice for sodium chloride. This is just table salt. And if you look at table salt under a microscope, you'll find these perfect little cubic crystals. And that's because if it's really pure table salt, the crystal lattice will be basically perfect. That the arrangement of the crystals are going to form themselves into these really nice crystal shapes. It doesn't have to be a cube. Different minerals are going to produce different shaped crystals. But a really pure sample will give you a really good crystal. Now, if you cool off the solution really rapidly, what happens is that these particles don't have a lot of time to find a partner. They don't have a lot of time to go out and sort of hold hands with the same mineral, with the same molecule. And so if you form a crystal really fast, what happens is that some impurities get caught up inside the crystal lattice. These impurities could have come just from the water that we used. It could have come in the actual sample. It could actually be from the air. There could be carbon dioxide or some other gases just dissolving into the solution from the air. And if those get trapped in that crystal lattice, you end up with a crappy crystal. You end up with a crystal that's not really perfect. And so essentially, I want to show you what this looks like. You can get really weird situations like this, what you see on your screen. So the green circles are our mineral that we're trying to make a crystal out of, and the ones that are odd colored, like this light green or this little blue one, are imperfections. They're imperfections because they are impurities. So if you cool off your crystal really rapidly, what you end up with is impurities get stuck in it. And when those impurities get stuck in it, the crystal grows wonky. You don't get good crystals. And usually the crystals actually form smaller crystals because they're interrupted by this impurity. So you get a bunch of kind of crummy crystals, little, ugly crystals, unlike if you have a slow, pure solution, you get these really pretty large crystals. So this particular sample was probably very pure and cooled off rather slowly. So that's why we get this really nice big geometric crystals. What we don't have going on is what you see on your screen. So big crystals means they cooled slowly and they were able to form a nice geometric pattern and push out those imperfections. So I hope that this video was helpful to you and that you can tell me how do different factors influence the growth of crystals and that you can explain the nanoscopic events that occur to create different features in crystals.